Parents of prisoners. What's the worst thing that happened to your child in there? I got a call from the juvenile detention center that my son's skull had been fractured by his cellmate over a gang dispute that escalated. I got in my car and rushed to the hospital, where I found out my son was bleeding from his brain, and the nurses told me to prepare for the worst. I sat in that waiting room with two things on my mind. Would my son live? And that the guards had to be lying. Neither my son nor his cellmate had gang ties. When I got the news my son would live, I was the happiest dad on earth. But there was a problem. An area of his brain responsible for speech had been damaged, meaning he couldn't talk, he couldn't tell me I love you, and couldn't tell me what actually happened. What's even worse is what the doctor told me after pulling me aside. The injuries weren't only on my son's head. He had internal injuries around his nether regions too, week-old trauma that had nothing to do with any fight. The next morning I went to the detention center. Officer Bryant, who'd called me about the fight, was at the front desk. "How's Caleb?" he asked me. "He can't speak anymore," I responded before asking, "Jason really did that much damage?" Fights get brutal here. I knew I had him when he said that. Jason's mom told me he's been in the lockdown unit since Sunday. She showed me the paperwork, I said. Bryant's face changed completely. He stood up, knocking papers off his desk. She must be confused. That's when Jason's mother, who I'd coordinated with, signed in loudly, "Here to see Jason Mitchell in lockdown unit B." Bryant went pale. He'd been caught lying right there. He dismissed me immediately after, and that night while I was at the hospital, an unknown number called me. A woman whispered, "I heard about your boy. Listen, I work at the facility. Tuesday nights, certain boys get taken to the counseling room instead of going to bed. Your son was one of those kids." My hands were shaking. The injury happened Tuesday night. I thanked the woman and hung up. I confronted the warden the next day. "My son got hurt on a Tuesday. I got told he gets taken to counseling on Tuesday. What happens in that room?" Warden Sparks pulled out a file. "Your son's medical intake shows pre-existing conditions." I grabbed the paper. The intake form was dated 6 weeks ago, but I could smell the fresh ink. The signature wasn't mine. They were forging documents. "You're covering up sexual assault." "That's a serious accusation. Be careful, Mr. Williams. Defamation of correctional staff is a crime." In the parking lot, a woman approached me. "They got your boy too?" She showed me her phone. "My nephew Timothy. Same brain injury 3 months ago. My sister's boy Dante, 6 months ago. I've been tracking it. 17 boys in 2 years. All Tuesday night incidents. All lost their ability to speak. 17? All the same injury pattern. Targeted trauma to the speech center. It's deliberate. They're silencing witnesses." She showed me another message. "Timothy saved this before he died. It's from a boy inside. Says there are cameras in the counseling room. Hidden ones. The warden keeps recordings. We need police. Deputy Chief Henderson's brother is Officer Henderson, one of the Tuesday night guards. The other is Cole, whose uncle runs internal affairs." I drove straight to the police station anyway. The desk sergeant cut me off when I mentioned the officers' names. "Filing false reports against law enforcement is a felony. Deputy Chief Henderson is a good man. His brother is decorated. Continue these lies and you'll be in a cell next to your son." I left shaking. They weren't going to help. They were protecting each other. That night I called my brother Deshaun and cousin James. Both had done time. "They're graping kids and destroying their speech centers so they can't testify," I told them. "My boy from inside has a cousin in maintenance there," Deshaun said. Tuesday night, Bryant works alone. 3 days later, we waited until 11 p.m. The service door was unlocked as promised. We made our way to the counseling room. Through the window, I saw Bryant with a boy bent over the table, maybe 14 years old. Deshaun kicked the door in. Bryant spun around, pants still undone. The kid collapsed, sobbing. James wrapped him in his jacket, carried him out to safety. Bryant reached for his radio, but Deshaun knocked it away and started recording on his phone. "Mr. Williams, this isn't—" I hit him. He went down hard, blood pouring from his nose. "Start talking," Deshaun said, still recording. "About Caleb. About all 17 boys." Bryant was sobbing. "It's not just us. The warden sells the videos. Hidden cameras in here. Judge buys them. State Senator Davies. 50,000 per video. You destroyed their speech centers on purpose. The warden said if they can't talk, they can't testify. Henderson knew how. Targeted trauma to Braca's area. Where are the recordings? Warden's office safe. Behind his family picture. Combination is 0-7-1-5. Deshaun left with the phone. 20 minutes later, he returned with a hard drive. Hundreds of videos. Everything. I knelt next to Bryant. "Are you ready?" Bryant started crying harder, blood running down his face and mixing with the snot and tears. His whole body was shaking as he looked up at me from the floor. I grabbed his shirt collar and pulled him closer. The pain he was feeling right now was nothing compared to what our boys went through. My fist was throbbing, but I didn't care. Deshaun kept his phone steady, making sure he got everything on video while James stood by the door watching the hallway. I asked Bryant who else was involved besides the names he'd already given us. He was sobbing so hard he could barely get the words out. The Harden brothers, he finally said. Officer Aaron Harden and Officer Caden Harden. Brothers who worked different shifts to cover more nights. Bryant said the warden picked which boys got sent to counseling based on who wouldn't be missed. Kids without strong families or connections on the outside. I made him explain exactly how they picked my son Caleb. Bryant wiped blood from his nose and said they went through intake forms looking for certain things. Single parents, low-income addresses, no lawyer listed on the paperwork. They figured families like mine wouldn't have the resources to fight back if something happened. My hands were shaking with rage, but I needed to hear everything. The rescued boy was still in the corner wrapped in James's jacket, his whole body trembling. I walked over to him and knelt down, keeping my voice soft. I told him he was safe now, and we were taking him somewhere no one would hurt him again. He just nodded, too scared to speak. Deshaun called me over and showed me what he'd found on the hard drive using his phone. There were hundreds of video files, all organized by date going back years. Each file had a price tag attached, and buyer initials that matched exactly what Bryant had told us. SD for Senator Davies, $50,000. Some files were marked with JH for the judge, $30,000 each. The numbers made me sick. These kids were being sold like products. I looked at the timestamps and found files from the Tuesday night my son was hurt. The file was there, but I couldn't bring myself to open it. Not yet. Bryant was still crying on the floor when I realized we needed to get out fast. Someone would notice he was missing from his post soon, and we couldn't be here when that happened. Deshaun found some extension cords in a supply closet, while James grabbed duct tape from a maintenance cart in the hall. We tied Bryant's hands and feet tight, then put tape over his mouth to keep him quiet. He tried to say something through the tape, but I didn't want to hear it. We left him there in the counseling room where he'd hurt so many kids. James picked up the boy in his jacket and carried him like he weighed nothing. The kid wrapped his arms around James's neck and buried his face in his shoulder. Deshaun grabbed the hard drive and his phone while I checked the hallway one more time. We moved fast through the service door and into the parking lot where our car was waiting. The whole place was quiet, except for the sound of our footsteps on the concrete. James put the boy in the back seat and got in next to him while Deshaun and I got in front. I started the car and drove slow and calm, even though my heart was racing. We couldn't draw any attention right now. Deshaun gave me directions to his girlfriend's house about 20 minutes away. She was a registered foster parent who'd taken in troubled kids before. The boy hadn't said a word the whole drive, just sat there wrapped in the jacket, staring at nothing. When we pulled up to the house, Josephine was already waiting at the door. Deshaun had called her on the way to let her know we were coming. She took one look at the boy and immediately went into caretaker mode. She brought him inside and sat him on the couch, then got him water and a blanket. That's when he finally spoke for the first time. His voice was so quiet we almost didn't hear him. "My name is Ryder," he said. Ryder Melton, 14 years old, been in detention for 3 months. His crime was shoplifting food from a grocery store because he was hungry. This was his 4th time in that counseling room. The first time was 2 weeks after he arrived. They told him it was for evaluation, but he knew something was wrong when Bryant locked the door. Each time got worse, and they threatened to hurt him more if he told anyone. The other boys in his unit knew, but they were all too scared to say anything. Some of them had been through it too. Josephine got her camera and started documenting Ryder's injuries while being gentle and explaining everything she was doing. There were bruises on his arms where they'd held him down, marks on his wrists from being restrained. She took photos of everything, creating a record that couldn't be denied or destroyed. She told us she'd seen similar trauma patterns in other boys over the years, but never had proof of the cause. Kids would come to her broken and unable to explain what happened. Now she finally understood why. Some had brain injuries that affected their speech. Others were just too traumatized to talk about it. The whole system had failed these children, and she'd been trying to help them heal without knowing the full truth. Ryder started crying again, and Josephine held him while he sobbed. Deshaun was already making copies of the hard drive on multiple computers. James stood by the window watching the street in case anyone followed us. I sat there thinking about my son in the hospital, unable to speak, unable to tell me what they'd done to him. Now I knew. Now we had proof. But this was just the beginning. Back at Josephine's place, I grabbed my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found the number Timothy's aunt had given me in the parking lot. My hands shook as I pressed call and waited for her to pick up. She answered on the 3rd ring, and I told her we had everything, the videos, Bryant's confession, all of it. I heard her start crying through the phone, and she kept saying thank you over and over, that she'd been waiting 2 years for someone to believe her about what happened to Timothy. While she was still on the phone, Deshaun pulled out a box of USB drives from his backpack and started making copies of everything on the hard drive. He plugged 3 laptops into different outlets around the room and started the copying process on each one. James went to the store and bought more USB drives, while Deshaun worked on uploading encrypted backups to 3 different cloud services using fake accounts he created with random email addresses. We couldn't risk losing this evidence if something happened to the physical copies. Josephine came over and told us she'd already called a trauma counselor she knew who specialized in helping kids who'd been through this kind of abuse. The counselor agreed to see Ryder first thing in the morning, and Josephine promised she'd keep him hidden at her house until we could make sure he was safe from the warden and his people. Ryder was sleeping on the couch now, still wrapped in James's jacket, and every few minutes he'd jerk awake and look around, scared, before remembering where he was. Deshaun finished the uploads and handed me 5 USB drives that I put in different pockets, then gave James 3 more to hide at his place. We agreed to meet up in the morning to figure out our next move, but I couldn't focus on planning anything. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep while thinking about Caleb alone in that hospital room. The machines beeping around him, nurses checking on him every hour, and him unable to tell anyone what really happened to him. These monsters were still walking free, while my boy couldn't even speak anymore. I kept seeing Bryant's face when we caught him, the way he'd had his pants undone with that kid bent over the table. How many times had that been Caleb in that room? How many Tuesday nights had my son gone through that while I thought he was safe in detention? I got up and paced around my apartment, looking out the window at the empty street below. We had the evidence, but the system was corrupt from top to bottom. The police wouldn't help. The warden had judges and senators buying his videos, and every person who was supposed to protect these kids were either involved or looking the other way. I decided we needed to move faster than the system usually worked, because every day these people stayed free was another day they could hurt more kids, or destroy evidence, or threaten witnesses. The next morning, I woke up to my phone buzzing with news alerts. Every local news site had the same story about Officer Bryant being found tied up at the detention center after what the warden was calling a gang-related break-in. The warden told reporters that gang members had broken in seeking revenge for one of their members, and Bryant had been caught in the middle of it. The news showed Bryant's employee photo and said he was recovering at home after the traumatic incident. My phone rang from an unknown number, and when I answered, a woman's voice said she was Bryant's wife, and her husband wanted to make a deal. She said he'd testify against everyone involved if we didn't press charges for what he'd done to those boys. Deshaun was sitting next to me and shook his head when I told him what she said, thinking it was obviously a trap to get us to meet somewhere. But I agreed to meet her at a public diner downtown because we needed Bryant's testimony to make sure everyone involved went down for this. An hour later, I walked into the diner and saw a woman sitting in a corner booth who looked like she hadn't slept in days. Her eyes were red and puffy from crying, and her hands shook as she lifted her coffee cup. She looked up when I sat down and immediately started talking about how she had no idea what her husband had been doing until he came home bloody last night and confessed everything. She pulled out her phone and showed me text messages between Bryant and the other guards where they discussed their Tuesday night activities in detail. She'd found them after going through his phone while he was in the shower, messages going back months about which boys they'd take to the counseling room and what they'd do to them. The messages made me sick to read, but they were more evidence we could use against all of them. She said Bryant had told her everything about the warden selling videos, about deliberately hurting the boys' brains so they couldn't testify, about the judge and senator who bought the recordings. I told her Bryant needed to turn himself in to the authorities and cooperate fully with any investigation if he wanted any chance at a lighter sentence. She nodded and said she'd already told him that, but then she grabbed my arm and warned me that the warden had connections everywhere in the city. She said we were all in danger now that we'd exposed what was happening, and the warden wouldn't let this evidence get out without fighting back. I left the diner and drove home, checking my mirrors constantly to see if anyone was following me. When I pulled up to my apartment building, 2 police cars were already parked outside with their lights flashing. 4 officers got out and walked toward me, one of them holding papers in his hand. He said they had a warrant for my arrest for assault and battery on Officer Bryant at the detention facility. I knew this was retaliation for what we'd done, but I couldn't run because they'd use that against me in court and make me look guilty of even more. Deshaun jumped out of his car that had been parked across the street and started recording with his phone while shouting that this was live streamed to Facebook and YouTube. The officers hesitated for a second when they saw the camera, but the lead officer grabbed my arm anyway and spun me around to cuff me. My wrists hurt from how tight he made them, while reading me my rights for assault and battery on a correctional officer. Deshawn kept the camera steady on us the whole time and told the growing crowd of neighbors that they were arresting me for exposing child abuse at the detention center. The officers shoved me into the back of the patrol car harder than they needed to, and I hit my head on the doorframe. During the ride to the station, I watched Deshawn's car following us and knew he was still recording everything through his windshield. At the station, they took my fingerprints and mugshot before putting me in a holding cell that smelled like piss and vomit. 2 hours passed before Deputy Chief Henderson himself walked in, wearing his uniform with all his medals and ribbons. He sat down across from me and said I was in serious trouble for attacking his brother's colleague. I told him I wanted a lawyer before answering any questions. He leaned forward and said lawyers wouldn't help someone who broke into a government facility and assaulted staff. I stayed quiet and stared at the wall behind him. He kept talking about how I could get 20 years for what I did and how my son would grow up without a father. I still didn't say anything. He slammed his hand on the table and said I was making things worse by not cooperating. That's when a young woman walked in carrying a briefcase and introduced herself as Haley Robbins, my court-appointed attorney. She told Henderson the interview was over and she needed to speak with her client privately. Henderson's face turned red, but he left the room after warning me this wasn't over. Haley waited until the door closed, then leaned close and whispered that she'd been waiting years for someone to expose what was happening at that facility. She pulled out a legal pad and said she'd been collecting complaints from families, but never had hard evidence to build a case. She got me released on bail within an hour, using some technicality about improper arrest procedures. Outside the station, she asked if we could go somewhere private to talk about what evidence we had. I took her to Deshawn's apartment where we had one of the USB drives hidden. She said she needed to see what was on it to know if we had enough for a federal case. I plugged the drive into Deshawn's laptop, but didn't let her take it, needing to know if we could trust her first. She watched 30 seconds of one video before covering her mouth and running to the bathroom to throw up. When she came back, her face was white, and she said this was enough to bring down everyone involved. She made some calls and arranged a meeting the next morning with an FBI agent named Donald Wyatt, who specialized in corruption cases. She said Wyatt had been investigating Senator Davies for campaign finance violations, and this could be the connection he needed. We met Wyatt at a federal building downtown, where he reviewed our evidence in a secure room. His hands shook as he watched the videos and read through Bryant's confession that Deshawn had recorded. He immediately opened a federal investigation and said local law enforcement couldn't interfere anymore. He assigned agents to protect me, Deshawn, James, and the rescued boy Ryder. That night, the FBI raided the detention center with a warrant for all computers and records. They arrested Warden Sparks at his home at 3 a.m. and found more videos and financial records in his personal safe. The local news showed footage of FBI agents carrying boxes of evidence out of the facility, while parents of detained kids watched from behind police tape. Bryant turned himself in to the FBI the next day after his wife convinced him it was his only chance to avoid life in prison. Agent Wyatt got him to wear a wire and meet with the other guards to talk about their Tuesday night activities. Bryant was shaking so bad during the meeting that Officer Henderson asked if he was sick. Bryant said he was just worried about the FBI raid and asked if they should be concerned. Henderson and Cole started talking about destroying evidence and moving money from their accounts. They mentioned the Hardin brothers, who also took part in the abuse, and said they needed to warn them. Bryant got them to admit on tape that they'd been doing this for years, and the warden paid them extra for keeping quiet. Within hours, the FBI arrested Cole, Henderson, and the Hardin brothers at their homes. The Hardin brothers tried to run, but got tackled in their backyard by federal agents. At the station, they all turned on each other trying to get better deals with prosecutors. Cole said it was Henderson's idea to target the speech centers so the boys couldn't testify. Henderson blamed the warden for organizing everything and keeping most of the money from selling videos. The Hardin brothers claimed they were forced to participate or they'd lose their jobs. Agent Wyatt told me they were all looking at federal charges that carried mandatory minimums of 25 years. The next morning, Agent Wyatt called me into his office and spread out bank records across his desk. The judge had wire transfers going back 6 years to accounts in the Cayman Islands that matched dates when videos were made. Over $2 million total just from him. Senator Davies was worse, with $3.8 million through shell companies his accountant set up. Wyatt showed me spreadsheets tracking every payment to every victim's assault date, and I had to sit down when I saw Caleb's name with $50,000 next to it. 3 days later, Ryder had to testify to the grand jury, and Josephine drove him to the federal courthouse downtown. I waited outside while she held his hand through 2 hours of questions about what happened in that room. He came out shaking, but the prosecutor said he did amazing and gave them everything they needed for indictments. The news broke that afternoon about the arrests, and my phone started ringing nonstop. Parents I'd never met were calling saying their sons wanted to talk now that the guards were locked up. 17 boys came forward over the next week, and every single one had the same injury pattern the doctors confirmed was deliberate trauma to the speech center. The FBI searched the warden's house again with better equipment and found a hidden room behind a bookshelf in his basement. Inside was a whole studio setup with editing computers and sound equipment worth $500,000. They found backup drives with every video organized by date and victim name going back 8 years. I drove to the hospital every morning to see Caleb and told him we got the bad men, even though he couldn't answer me. His eyes would track my face, and when I said Bryant was going to prison forever, he squeezed my hand harder than he had since the injury. The nurses said that was a good sign. His brain was healing. Haley came by the hospital with stacks of paperwork for the civil lawsuit she was filing against the state and every person involved. She said the settlement would be enough to pay for lifetime care for all the victims, plus punitive damages that could reach $100 million. The judge tried to run 2 days later when his lawyer told him the charges were coming. Airport security caught him at the international terminal with a fake passport and $30,000 in cash. The arrest video was all over the news with him crying and claiming he was innocent while they dragged him away in handcuffs. Senator Davies held a press conference the next morning, denying everything, but reporters had already found the shell company records connecting him to the payments. His own party leaders went on TV demanding he resign immediately and cooperate with investigators. 3 of his biggest donors pulled their support within hours. That night, Deshaun called me from his car saying 2 men in a black SUV had followed him home from his warehouse job. They stayed parked outside his apartment for an hour before driving off when he called 911. The FBI put protection on our whole family the next day, with agents following us everywhere. James called me crying the morning after saying his boss at the auto shop fired him out of nowhere. The boss said someone important called and threatened to shut down his business if James kept working there. Haley immediately filed a wrongful termination suit, and the FBI added witness intimidation charges to their case. The intimidation attempts just made us more determined to see this through to the end. 2 weeks passed before I got some good news at the hospital, when a nurse pulled me aside during Caleb's therapy session and showed me his progress chart with marks going up for the first time. She pointed at his throat movements on the monitor, and I could see him trying so hard to make sounds come out, even though they weren't real words yet. The sounds were rough and broken, but they were there, and that meant his brain was finding new pathways around the damage. I sat with him for 3 hours that day, just listening to him try different noises and squeezing his hand every time he managed a new one. That same afternoon, Bryant's wife showed up at Haley's office with a box full of papers and receipts she'd been collecting for months before she knew what they meant. She spread them out on the conference table, showing cash withdrawals matching dates of camera equipment purchases, and told Haley she'd heard Bryant on the phone talking about angles and lighting for the counseling room. The divorce papers were already filed, and she wanted immunity in exchange for everything she knew about Bryant's side business, selling copies of videos to private collectors he'd met online. Haley recorded her statement for 4 hours, getting every detail about conversations she'd overheard and suspicious behavior she'd noticed over their 8-year marriage. 3 days later, Agent Wyatt called me at 2 in the morning, saying the FBI had just raided facilities in Georgia and Alabama after finding connections in the warden's emails. The same company that ran our detention center operated 6 others across the Southeast, and investigators found the same Tuesday night patterns at 3 of them, with boys suffering identical brain injuries. The network was bigger than anyone imagined, with over 40 staff members across all facilities sharing videos and techniques for silencing victims. Within a week of those raids, Officer Henderson's lawyer contacted the FBI saying his client wanted to make a deal before the other guards started talking. Henderson came in with Cole, and they spent 12 hours in separate rooms spilling everything about how the warden recruited them and taught them exactly where to hit boys to damage their speech centers without killing them. They gave up names of buyers, showed bank records of payments, and described the whole system of selecting victims who had no family support or whose parents seemed too poor to fight back. Both officers signed plea agreements for 15-year sentences in exchange for testifying against everyone else, including the judge who'd been their biggest customer for 5 years. The next morning, I watched Caleb work with a new machine the hospital brought in that tracked his eye movements across a screen full of letters. The therapist spent an hour teaching him how to focus on each letter long enough for the computer to register his selection and build words. His first attempts were just random letters, but after 3 days of practice, he managed to spell out DAD and the machine spoke it out loud in a robot voice. Then he added LOVE and YOU, one letter at a time, taking almost 10 minutes, but hearing those words even from a computer made me break down crying right there in the therapy room. The state governor held a press conference that week, announcing a complete investigation of every juvenile facility in the state with new federal oversight requirements. They brought in Josephine to design a victim advocacy program with mandatory cameras in all areas and independent monitors reviewing footage weekly. She called me that night crying because they were finally taking this seriously, and her new position would let her protect kids like Ryder from ever going through this again. Speaking of Ryder, the foster family that took him in specialized in helping kids recover from trauma, and they'd already gotten him into daily therapy sessions. Josephine visited him twice a week and told me he was starting to talk about what happened, though he still had nightmares every night and couldn't be alone in rooms with adult men. The family understood his triggers and gave him space to heal while making sure he knew he was safe now and would never go back to any facility. Our civil lawsuit suddenly got priority scheduling after 3 major news networks ran segments about the case, and protesters started showing up at the state capitol demanding justice. Haley said the initial settlement conference had the state offering $50 million for all victims combined, but she laughed in their faces and walked out saying, "We'd see them in court if they thought 17 destroyed lives were worth that little." The media attention brought in donations from across the country to help pay for the boys' medical care while we waited for the real settlement that Haley promised would be 10 times their insulting first offer. A month later, I sat in a wood-paneled room in Washington answering questions from senators about what happened to Caleb and the other boys. They showed videos of the facilities and charts of the injury patterns, while I explained how the local police protected the guards and threatened anyone who tried to report the abuse. 3 senators promised to introduce legislation requiring federal oversight of all juvenile facilities and mandatory reporting of any suspicious injuries directly to the FBI instead of local authorities. The hearing lasted 6 hours and ended with the committee chairman apologizing to all the families for the system's failure to protect our children. Bryant's sentencing came 2 months after his arrest, and even with his cooperation, the federal judge gave him 25 years, calling his crimes against children unforgivable. They had to put him in protective custody immediately because word had already spread through the prison about what he'd done, and other inmates were making threats before he even arrived. The warden's trial started 3 weeks later, and I sat in that courtroom every single day, watching him squirm in his chair while prosecutors played those videos he'd been selling. The jury members couldn't even look at the screen, and one woman ran out crying during the worst parts. His lawyer tried claiming Bryant forced him into it, but the financial records showed millions in offshore accounts dating back 8 years before Bryant even started working there. The prosecutor brought in 23 boys to testify through written statements, since most still couldn't speak, and each one described the same pattern of being taken to that counseling room on Tuesday nights. When they showed the medical reports with brain scans proving deliberate trauma to the speech centers, even the judge had to take a recess to compose himself. The verdict came back guilty on all 117 counts, including production of child abuse material, conspiracy to commit assault, and running a criminal enterprise. The judge called him a monster who'd betrayed society's most vulnerable and gave him life without parole plus 300 years to run consecutively. They had to drag him out screaming about appeals while the families in the gallery clapped and cried. The judge's trial happened a month later, and more victims came forward from outside the detention center, including 3 boys from his neighborhood and 2 from the youth basketball team he coached. His bank records showed payments to the warden going back 12 years, and the FBI found thousands more videos on hard drives hidden in his basement behind a false wall. He tried to cut a deal offering to name other buyers, but the prosecutor said they already had everyone from the evidence we'd collected that night. The jury deliberated for only 2 hours before finding him guilty, and he got 40 years federal time with no possibility of parole until he served at least 30. They made him register as a sex offender, and his victims' families filed civil suits that would take everything he owned, including his house, where some of the abuse happened. Senator Davies went to trial 2 weeks after that, and his political connections couldn't save him when the FBI showed records of him using campaign funds to buy videos through shell companies he'd set up. His wife sat in court the first day, but never came back after hearing what her husband had been buying, and she filed for divorce that same week. The prosecution showed he'd spent over $3 million on videos over 5 years, and had even requested specific boys be targeted based on photos from detention center intake files. He got 30 years and lost his government pension worth $2 million that got redirected to a victim compensation fund. His wife held a press conference apologizing to all the families, saying she never knew and wished she could have stopped it somehow. After all the trials wrapped up, Haley became famous for her work on our case, with news stations calling her a hero lawyer who took down a whole network of predators. She started getting calls from families all over the country dealing with similar situations and decided to open a nonprofit law firm dedicated to protecting kids in state custody. The state gave her a grant to run it, and she hired 5 more lawyers within the first month. Agent Wyatt got a big commendation ceremony in Washington, where the FBI director said our evidence was the key to breaking up similar operations in 6 other states. He told reporters afterward that regular people standing up against corruption is what makes cases like this possible, and thanked our family for being brave enough to fight back. 4 months after that night in the counseling room, the hospital finally cleared Caleb to come home with round-the-clock nursing care that the settlement money would cover for as long as he needed it. They set up his room with all the medical equipment, including machines to help strengthen his throat muscles and a computer system for communication. He was learning sign language and making progress every day, with his hands getting steadier and his movements more precise. The speech therapist came 3 times a week and said the fact he was trying so hard to make sounds was a really good sign, even though nothing clear came out yet. Deshawn started visiting youth groups to tell them about predators in the system and how to protect themselves if they ever got locked up. Josephine helped him put together a whole program with warning signs to watch for and numbers kids could call if something happened to them. They went to schools, churches, and community centers, reaching hundreds of kids every month with their message. James couldn't find work after getting fired until Haley offered him a job as an investigator at her new law firm, using his street knowledge to help families whose kids were trapped in the system. His wrongful termination lawsuit against his old company settled for $200,000 when they couldn't explain why he got fired right after testifying. He used the money to buy a house and started taking night classes to get his private investigator license. Timothy's aunt reached out to all the families and started a support group that met every Thursday at the community center to talk about what we'd been through and how to heal. She said having closure about who killed Timothy helped her sleep for the first time in years, even though the pain would never fully go away. 6 months after that night in the counseling room, I was sitting with Caleb doing his speech exercises when he looked right at me and his mouth moved different from before. The sound that came out was rough and slurred, but I heard it clear as day when he said "Dad" for the first time since his injury. The speech therapist started crying and said more words would come now that he'd broken through that first barrier. 2 weeks later, Ryder showed up at our door wearing a clean school uniform and looking nothing like the broken kid we'd saved that night. He hugged me tight and said he was getting straight A's now and wanted to be a lawyer like Haley to help other kids who got hurt. His foster parents waited in the car while he thanked us for saving his life and told Caleb he was brave for fighting back, even without words. The state shut down the detention center 3 months after the arrests and announced they were converting it into a community center for at-risk youth. They held a ceremony where they put up a bronze plaque with Timothy's name and the names of 4 other boys who didn't survive their injuries from that place. Timothy's aunt spoke at the ceremony about how the community failed these children, but would never forget them again. Our case got picked up by national news, and within 6 months, Congress passed something called Caleb's Law, requiring video monitoring and independent oversight of all juvenile facilities across the country. The president signed it at a public ceremony in the Rose Garden with me and Caleb sitting in the front row while reporters took pictures. The law made it so no facility could operate without cameras in every room and monthly inspections by people who didn't work for the state. The settlement money started coming through 8 months after everything happened, and it was enough to make sure Caleb would have the best therapy and care for the rest of his life. We packed up our old apartment and moved to a quiet neighborhood 40 miles away where nobody knew our story and Caleb could recover without people staring at him everywhere we went. The new house had a therapy room set up with all his equipment and a yard where he could practice walking without his cane when his legs got stronger. Other states started launching investigations into their own juvenile facilities after our case showed what could be hidden behind those walls. The FBI helped coordinate raids in 12 states that led to 43 more arrests and hundreds of victims getting identified through medical records showing the same brain injury patterns. Some facilities got shut down completely, while others had their entire staff replaced and new monitoring systems installed. Caleb's right side stayed weak from the brain damage, but he learned to write with his left hand after months of occupational therapy. One afternoon, he grabbed a pencil and slowly wrote out, "Thank you for fighting for me," on a piece of paper that I still keep in my wallet today. His handwriting looked like a little kid's, but those 6 words meant everything after watching him struggle to communicate for so long. A year after that night in the counseling room, the prosecutor called to say they needed Caleb's testimony for the last trial of a guard who'd been caught later. Caleb sat in the courtroom with his eye-tracking computer and typed out his whole story while the jury watched on a big screen as each word appeared letter by letter. When he finished typing about what happened in that room, the guard's lawyer didn't even try to cross-examine, and the jury came back with guilty on all counts in less than an hour. The judge gave him 30 years and said Caleb's testimony was the bravest thing he'd seen in 40 years on the bench. Deshawn proposed to Josephine on the anniversary of the night we saved Ryder, and they got married 6 months later at her church with our whole family there. Caleb stood up as best man using his communication device to give a speech about how Deshawn saved not just him, but all the boys who would have been hurt if we hadn't stopped it. There wasn't a person in that church who wasn't crying when Caleb's computer voice said Deshawn was a hero who deserved all the happiness in the world. Josephine wore her grandmother's dress, and Deshawn couldn't stop smiling the whole ceremony, even when James made jokes during his toast about Deshawn finally settling down. Caleb started online school since regular school was too hard with his disabilities and surprised everyone by getting perfect grades in every subject. His teachers sent emails saying he was one of their smartest students, and his essays about disability rights were getting shared with other educators as examples of excellent writing. He told me through his device that he wanted to become an advocate for disabled victims of crime and help kids who couldn't speak for themselves find justice. The online program let him work at his own pace and take breaks when his therapy sessions wore him out, but he never missed an assignment. The support group Timothy's aunt started grew to over 50 families who met every month at the new community center that used to be the detention facility. We'd sit in a circle sharing our stories and celebrating small victories like a kid saying their first word after brain surgery or getting through a day without nightmares. Some families drove 3 hours to come to meetings because there was nowhere else where people understood what we'd been through. Everyone brought food, and the kids who could walk played together while parents talked about lawyers and therapy and how to help their children heal from things that should never have happened. 3 years after that first support group meeting, I walked into Caleb's room to find him practicing his speech exercises with his therapist. His voice came out slower and deeper than it used to be before the injury, but the words were clear and complete. "Dad, can you help me practice my graduation speech?" he asked, holding up the paper he'd been working on for weeks. I sat down next to him and watched him read each line carefully, his tongue working hard around certain sounds that still gave him trouble. "I remember everything that happened to me," he said, looking straight at me, "and I'm proud of you for not giving up when everyone told you to stop fighting." My eyes started burning, and I had to look away for a second. The therapist smiled and packed up her equipment, telling us she'd see us next week for our final session before graduation. 2 weeks later, I sat in the front row of the community center's main hall that they'd set up for the online school's graduation ceremony. Caleb walked across the stage in his cap and gown, using his cane for balance but standing tall and steady. The principal announced his name with honors and mentioned his perfect grades in every subject. As he accepted his diploma, I thought about that night 3 years ago when we'd broken into the counseling room and found Bryant with that kid. We hadn't just survived what they did to us. We'd torn down their whole sick system and made sure no other kids would suffer like Caleb did. Time to close this chapter of our commentary adventures. Appreciate you letting me be your witty sidekick through all the twists and turns. Like the video, it helps more than you think.